So this is part 3, Violence in the Name of the Faith, chapter 6, part 3, Religious Terrorism. Okay, so now we're going to talk about dissident religious terrorism. And in the previous chapter, we talked about state terrorism, which is terrorism from above, and dissident terrorism was terror from below. So this is terror from below, but these are dissidents that are actually motivated by religion rather than political motivations. So we're going to talk about religious zealotry in the Middle East. So the Middle East is the host to the major sites for all three major monotheistic faiths. Jerusalem, for example, the holy city is the holy city for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So as we can see, that immediately throws up a red flag, right? Because this is the holy city for three different and somewhat competing faiths. So, as Martin says, the convergence heightens tensions, leading to some extremists to justify terrorist violence as a means of obeying God's commands to cleanse the land of competing claims. So, we see that the radical Islamists are looking to eradicate the lands of the Jewish faith and eliminate they don't just want them out, they want to eliminate them from the area. In the book, Martin uses the Grand Mosque incident from 1979, the 1979 Hajj, which was Hajj is a pilgrimage, to Mecca, and 300 extremists took over the mosque, and eventually, in defiance of the Saudi family, and eventually, French commandos had to come in and assist in taking it over, and 100 radicals were killed in the process. So, one of the other examples he uses is the Hebron Mosque massacre, in which Baruch Goldstein fired on worshippers with an assault rifle that he was able to get in Israel in February of 1994. And so the death toll has been contested. Some say it was 29, some say it was 50. I don't know how you can contest a death toll, but I guess each side makes it more horrific than the other in order to affect their followers. So Hamas responded with a suicide bombing campaign in Israel, and hundreds more were killed over the course of the next few years in retaliation for this event. And we see that oftentimes when a group attacks another group. Sometimes a retaliation by the Israeli government is far more devastating than the actual event that occurred. Sometimes when the Israeli government does something to provoke an attack by either Hamas or Hezbollah or another group within inside the country. So it's been an ongoing conflict. It's very, very complicated. I urge you to read the book and to do further research on the area because, again, it's a cause and it's a conflict that is about perception by both groups. So with religious zealotry, we see that sometimes when one group commits an act, the other group will retaliate against them. But there's also dissidence within groups and within a religion. And the Rabin assassination was committed by a man named Yigal Amir, and he was a Jewish extremist, and he assassinated the Israeli prime minister, which is tantamount to killing the president in our country in November of 1995. And he claimed that the act was justified because Rabin had made peace with the Palestinians through the Oslo Accords in 1993. So he was mad that the Jewish people were attempting to come to a peaceful accord with Hamas and with the Palestinians and try and reach a peaceful resolution. So there's someone, a dissident within his own faith, that was willing to commit an extremist act and a terrorist act in order to affect or to gain followers towards that particular cause, which was not having peace, not having a peace with the Palestinians. Another example of sectarian violence or religious violence that they use is in Iraq. After the U.S. military invasion brought the collapse of Saddam Hussein, President Bush at the time famously got on board the ship and declared that the war was over, or that we had defeated them. Unfortunately, he was far from right. He was actually wrong. And when he defeated Saddam, when Saddam was overthrown, it created a vacuum for an insurgency to occur. So in Iraq, most of the country, unlike other parts of the world, most of Iraq, most of the Muslims in Iraq were from the Shia sect. Saddam happened to be a Sunni Muslim, and he was able to keep the Shias at bay because he was a dictator and he ruled with a ruthlessly. So when Saddam was eliminated, it led to a vacuum where the Shias rose up to try to take over the government and install a Shia government similar to the one that's in Iran. So whether we didn't anticipate this happening or whether we did anticipate but didn't care, after we defeated Saddam, we were unable to contain the insurgency that followed, and the insurgency that followed was mostly a religious insurgency between Sunni and Shia sects that were trying to take over the government. And the Shia had been second-class citizens under Saddam's regime. So another important part of religious dissident terrorism are the holy warriors known as the Mujahideen, who are sworn to defend the faith. And a case in point are the Afghan Arabs. And a Mujahideen are the holy warriors who we talked about earlier in the Lesser Jihad. They are, in the Lesser Jihad, they're out to defend the faith of Islam against infidels. So the Mujahideen, they mobilized to defend Afghanistan from the 1979 Soviet invasion, which lasted until 1989. And so they came from all over the world to defend Afghanistan against the Russian invading army. And you cannot, this event is one of the most important events in the development of radical Islam as it exists in the world today. I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of the number and the people, the Afghan Arabs that went there and that were trained during this conflict. And so Osama bin Laden was one of these Afghan Arabs that went there and trained and fought against the Soviet army. And many of the subsequent people that became popular and legendary in the movement also fought against the Soviet army. And it wasn't just the Mujahideen, wasn't just holy warriors. There were other groups in the country. It's a very tribal area. And so there were other companies, including the Northern Alliance, that fought against them, and they were allies. And they fought for the cause to drive the Soviet Union out of the Afghan region. The war for the Soviet Union has been compared to the United States conflict in Vietnam, and in which the United States fought for the South Vietnamese against the Northern Vietnamese. And at the time, the communist regime in North Vietnam was being supplemented by communist the USSR, which was Russia, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they backed, and China also, they backed the North Vietnamese against the United States. So during this conflict in Afghanistan, it was the United States' turn to kind of get payback. So the United States actually supplied the Mujahideen, including Osama bin Laden, with comfort and aid against their enemy. And comfort and aid, I mean weaponry. They supplied them with weapons so that they could fight against um, a larger and more powerful army. And eventually they succeeded. They wore the Russians down after 10 years, and the Russians eventually left the country. And that's creating a vacuum where the Mujahideen eventually turned into the Taliban, and they ruled the southern part of the country while the Northern Alliance. It was a fragmented country, which allowed other groups to come into the country and train terrorist armies to fight in other conflicts throughout the world, other conflicts against the West, basically. So it became a training ground for um, the Mujahideen and holy warriors to fight. So the Mujahideen follow a strict literal interpretation of the Quran, and they believe that their violent campaign is righteous. They know that their ultimate victory is inevitable, but they also know that profound sacrifice may be required to attain that victory. So these are the holy warriors that went to and that have fought in campaigns throughout the world, the Mujahideen. So from the Mujahideen um, and the and from his experience in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden formed the Al Qaeda network, and it's a movement and a loose network, and it's inspired by bin Laden's worldview. So, as we said before, bin Laden had been an Afghan Arab, um, and so he himself was came from a wealthy Arab family, and so he himself was able to initially found and fund the organization. On page 150 in the book, Martin notes several organizational um, things about Al Qaeda, and one is that they hold no territory. So there's no, they were operating within Afghanistan, but they were thrown out by the United States when we invaded the country after September 11th. So they really hold no territory. They do not champion any ethno-national group. In other words, they don't champion the Afghans. They don't champion uh, the Arabs. They're a religious organization, and they have no top-down structure. Although Bin Laden was ostensibly the leader, um, and they have no state sponsorship. They couldn't, although we tried to blame different states for sponsoring them, we really couldn't prove affirmatively that they really had any state sponsorship. Their political demands, politically, their demands are vague at best. Their demands generally are more religious demands, um, and so their worldview is religious. They have a religious worldview as opposed to um, a political one, and they've become a movement throughout the world. Their um, their effectiveness has spawned a movement rather than just being part of the group. So their writings and their teachings can be passed on to other groups, um, and so they've been effective in that way. In that, although we've cut off some or most of their leadership at times, they've been able to get other people to follow them, and followers, certainly lone wolf types, but also other cells and other groups, have emulated or have moved towards their cause. So this is a little history of their cause. Bin Laden was enraged because the royal family allowed the United States into Kuwait to land in Saudi territory during the war when we fought to have the Iraqis removed from Kuwait. So initially, uh, bin Laden had his training camps were in the Sudan in the early 90s. He moved back to Afghanistan in 1996, and he solidified his group there and his anti-American attacks, and they perpetrated several attacks, major attacks against United States interests prior to the attacks on September 11th. So he he was able to, um, and they've boasted that through his organization, 50,000 operatives were trained and are in 60 countries. So the Al Qaeda remains a major player on the world stage as a terrorist organization and movement, and we see that ISIS has sprung up also in the vacuum created by the war in Iraq and the warring factions between the Sunni and Shia. In that vacuum was created the group ISIS, which operates in northern Iraq and then crosses over the borders into other countries in the Middle East. But there have been other groups that have been um, throughout the world, religious groups, particularly Muslim. Abu Sayyaf was popular or active in the Philippines um, in the 1990s into the 2000s. They their MO or modus operandi at the time was to kidnap mostly American tourists, and hold them hostage until the United States either paid a ransom, which theoretically we don't do, but they would hold people captive, and sometimes through the Philippine government, restitution was paid to the group in order to get the have the people released. Its most famous act was a triple kidnapping in 2000 and a bombing near a military base in 2002, um, and also the bombing of a ferry, which killed over 100 people in 2004. So they've been active quite in the last several years. The Philippine government has cracked down on them, and so they haven't been as active in the last few years. But certainly, at the time, they were reigning. They had a terror campaign that was quite effective in the Philippines. Martin gives some other examples in the book, and you can look at them there on pages 153, Laska Jihad, the civil war in Algeria. So you can read about those. I'd like to go over a little bit about the case of Aim Shinrikyo in Japan. And this is a group that is a religious group, but they've also been described as being a cult also. So Shoko Asahara, he was the leader of the cult. He founded it in 1987, and he believed that there was going to be Armageddon, which would be sparked by a U.S.-Japanese war. And he kind of in fashioned himself that he was the reincarnation of Jesus and Buddha, and encouraged his followers to stockpile biological and chemical weapons to prepare for this Armageddon. At the peak, there were 9,000 members in Japan and 40,000 members worldwide. So sometimes there's a fine line between when groups start out, they have these vivacious leaders that are able to attract people to follow them, and so Asahara was one of those folks, and so it becomes a religion, but it also becomes a cult, and they're very interesting groups to read about, and the progression from being a religious group into a cult. Um, and so he got these followers, he got these people to follow him, and it was quite interesting what happened um, as he moved forward with his organization. So there's quite a bit written about Amshin Rinkyo. You can go back and you should read about it. It's an interesting case, and I only bring it up because of the fact that it was that there were chemical weapons used. It was a chemical weapon attack. So um, the in March 20th, 1990, members of the group placed packages containing sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system. They put them on the ground and they punctured them with umbrellas and walked off the trains. Um, 12 people died, thousands were injured. I mean, the gas it immediately causes um, problems, and it's not like a biological attack where sometimes the effects aren't felt until a week later. It was a chemical attack, and it happened instantaneously. The people started breathing in the sarin, and the people that were closest to the initial release perished. Other people were sickened, and thousands um, were able to, seek help in hospitals. What happened after the attack and the members were caught, and they realized that it was Ashihara that perpetrated the attack. They went back and looked and realized that this wasn't his first attack, that there had been a couple of deaths um, prior to this that were unexplained, and they really didn't know what happened. They kind of didn't attribute it to a sarin gas attack or any other kind of attack. He actually tried to poison people in Japan by blowing anthrax off of a building from a fan. Yeah, he was a real nice fella, and they didn't realize that when the anthrax mixed in the atmosphere, it lost its potency. So that's why they switched to um, sarin. So I urge you to read about them, Google them, and try and read about. I'll see if I can post something in the additional reading if you're interested in reading about this particular group. It was a very uh, devastating attack. It people wouldn't ride the subways for weeks and days after in Tokyo. So when Aim Shinrikyo when they um, set off those uh, canisters filled with sarin, it created a terror in the subway system, and people wouldn't um, ride on the subways. Um, and so that had the effect, even if it didn't kill as many people as he wanted to kill, it still had the effect of terrorizing the community and throwing the city of Tokyo into disarray for several weeks. So um, now we'll look a little bit at the future of religious terrorism, and religion is a central feature of the new terrorism. And again, the new terrorism, we've talked about it a little bit before. The new terrorists seek to use weapons of mass destruction, as the group in Japan had done. They also they're more they don't call in warnings to their attacks, so their attacks tend to be more lethal. Um, and so they've defined this new, I hate to use the word breed of terrorists, as more dangerous as in terrorists in previous generations. So, Al Qaeda and its terrorists and its affiliates have used cell-based structures to accomplish their mission, and the indiscriminate attacks on civilians and non-combatants as part of their um, strategy. Um, so counterterrorist strategy in the 21st century will need to recognize the religious basis of this terrorism. And we'll talk about it later on in later chapters. The cell based um, comes from a right wing white supremacist group that started the cell in using and perpetrating their own crimes in the United States. That's where that um, originated, the use of a cell to carry out an attack. So Martin argues that um, the counterterrorism strategy, will need to address the ease with which religious propaganda is spread, especially through the internet. We talked about a little bit before how a person can be radicalized by sitting in front of a computer and watching the internet. Um, and so the priming of a new generation um, of Islamic extremists who may act globally. Um, so with travel throughout the world, there's a lot easier in today's, um, although there's trying to put a travel ban on it, but generally speaking, a person can get on a jet and fly from one country to another. Um, and the evolution of Al Qaeda to symbol an ideology. So Al Qaeda as a group, it's not that important anymore. Now, what's important has become them as a symbol and an ideology. They're not just a group; they're an ideology that people follow. And he also argues that the role of Christian extremists in maintaining that the war on terror is a religious war. This previous administration, their narrative was that, and the president, he sometimes was criticized by the right for not characterizing it as a religious war, and rather than inflame um, the majority of Muslims that are peace loving people, he refused to use the narrative that it was a religious war and that the West was fighting against Islam, and so and that um, narrative is something that the extremists in the Middle East use against us and use to their favor, is that they say that the West is waging a war against them, a religious war. So that concludes chapter 6. This was the third part. Again, I can't emphasize to you how important it is to read the text, read the chapter. If you have any questions about the chapter, send me an email, and I will see you next week.